thank you, Jayne, so much for being here. It's lovely to have you. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, so I'm Jayne Mattingly. I'm the CEO and founder of Recovery, Love, and Care. I started that off as a blog years ago, talking about my own recovery with an eating disorder. And then I turned it into a business. I have my master's in clinical mental health counseling. I specialized in eating disorders, worked as a therapist, and now work as an eating disorder recovery coach. That means that I provide supplemental support and care to people within their recovery, whether it's eating disorders, disordered eating, body image, or just finding self-acceptance. And I have now, that has blossomed into a group practice. So we've been doing virtual support through a HIPAA compliant software database for about 4 years now. It's obviously super timely with COVID. But we have coaches on our team and a dietitian and, people that can work through a more tailored approach to recovery for each individual. And it's more of just like here and now support, helping you with things like body image and things that you might not be able to touch on in therapy because you're working through past traumas or, diagnosable mental illnesses and things of that nature. So that's my business. And my presence on social media and Instagram is talking about that, but also helping people, accept themselves, body acceptance, self-acceptance, bringing to light, the truth surrounding those things. I live with chronic illness and disability, and, I'm talking about kind of recovery, and that can be a tough thing. So that's a little tidbit about me.
Well, thank you so much, Jayne. I'm excited to dive in and learn a little bit more about and share some inspiration for everyone who's tuning in, just to, maybe feeling a little bit stuck in their recovery, and maybe feeling like we've chatted about before starting recording this about how people can feel kind of stuck in their recovery, feeling like they're failing or they're not where they're supposed to be. So I'm excited to dive in and learn a little bit more about what has helped you through your recovery. So the question I ask everyone is, if you can think of one thing that sticks out about your recovery that you feel was very helpful, maybe a turning point, or maybe just something significant that you feel has helped you turn that corner in recovery, or was a strong piece, what would that be?
Yeah, well, I guess I'm going to cheat and give you two parts. So the first would be the importance of self-care. Recovery, Love, and Care is named after the importance of self-care and self-love within the process of recovery from anything. And, no matter how many excuses we have, it's so important to practice self-care and understanding what that means. It doesn't have to be so luxurious. I think there's different levels and tiers of that. And we deserve those luxurious things, but coming from accessibility standpoint, when you're sad, allowing to feel the feelings, cry. When you're tired, allowing yourself to rest, setting boundaries with your energy and time. That's like the most rudimentary form of self-care that I think is so important that we don't honor within our recovery, because we are, usually that person, within their eating disorder is so high functioning within the chaos and the dysfunction of their lives, and self-care, just it's not there. That was huge for me. So, in my recovery, really having things set aside, my dietitian and therapist at the time had me set aside like a self-care kit, where it was like a very sensorial experience where I looked at all the five senses and I just immersed myself in that. Whether it was, urge surfing and, while I wanted to use behaviors, after I used behaviors or whatnot, so I can condition my brain that even if I'm having thoughts that are super negative and unkind, doesn't mean I have to act on them, and I can treat myself and stop the cycle. So that was super helpful. And just really changed everything about my recovery. And I use it all the time helping my clients as well. And then another thing I would say, like, to piggyback off of that, is understanding that full recovery is possible. And I believe I embody that, but understanding it's a practice and it's not a destination. So there's certain concepts in recovery like body image and body acceptance and food freedom and all that kind of stuff. And we don't just get there and then stop. We have to constantly practice the work. And I think that can feel daunting at times, but it can also help us manage expectations within recovery and not feel like we're failing at it.
Thank you, Jayne. Yeah, I have a lot of follow-up questions, a lot of great stuff there. So breaking this into two parts with the self-care, what do you, when you mentioned it doesn't look like how people paint it to be. What would you describe self-care to be? What do you find with your clients and you in your recovery? Um, yeah, does that question make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I think sometimes we have to look at it from Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which I think actually you guys just posted about on your Instagram stories. I saw, but that's something that's so important. It's like our basic needs. So like I see a lot with clients, little things like having to like relieve themselves and go to the bathroom. They like will hold that in because they feel it's an inconvenience to do, and to honor their basic needs. That self-care is those basic needs, like having a roof over your head, being able to go to the bathroom, hopefully being able to brush your teeth and shower and take care of yourself, and finding routine there, medication, med compliance, things like that. But also, things of what can I do right now that will be positive towards my recovery? What can I do right now that will be helpful towards my recovery? And having that as your recovery mindset, rather than saying my eating disorder wants to do this or my disordered self wants to do this, but I have to do this. Then you're going to always feel that resistance, and it's going to make self-care as a chore, which it doesn't need to be. Like feeling your feelings is self-care. I think, sometimes crying, screaming, self-care, that's self-care. Also, it could be a little bit more luxurious, skincare, making, thinking about your five senses, making it more of a sensorial experience for yourself and calming yourself down, having a bedtime routine, just like you did when you were a child. I think those are really important things to do too. But I think it's so layered. And I think first we have to find those basic needs have to be met before we can build on top of those. So yeah, that's where I would start.
Yeah. And I'm curious for your journey, what with self-care, why do you think it was so impactful? What do you think about self-care was so impactful for you?
That's such a good question. Because for me, I think so much of my eating disorder was to numb a lot of things, and to numb out painful emotions that I was scared of feeling. And so when we practice self-care, we're not numbing out anymore. We're feeling it, but we're learning how to ride the emotion. We're learning how to, live through it and cope. And I have yet to meet, and this includes myself, anyone in recovery who has true patience. I think a lot of people with eating disorders and disordered eating, that's something genetically like that we just struggle with like patience. We want that like right away satisfaction because that's what we've gotten through our eating disorders. And so coping and self-care really taught me patience. It taught me 1% better rather than 100% better. That like sitting down and listening to some music while doing some breath work and, putting an ice pack on my chest was something that would make me 5% better and not, 100% better, and then crash and use self-sabotaging behaviors. And I think that was a big thing for me, is that I could feel the feelings and not, die. I didn't have to get rid of the feelings. I didn't have to numb them out. So exposure to that, I think, was a big thing. And also just stopping the cycle of self-sabotage. If I were to use behaviors, I would then punish myself. And then, that's the whole cycle of self-sabotage. So I think self-care then taught me, like, even if I don't like myself, or even if I'm doing something that I'm not proud of, it doesn't mean that I have to punish myself. That's just not how I'm not going to be able to help myself that way.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. There's again so much you brought up, so I'm going to try to. I guess my
Mm-hmm.
next question would be, and this kind of leads into the second piece that you said was very helpful, but with the, when you think of recovery as this like destination versus like this kind of timeline and thing that you continue to it's I feel like a lot of people talk about that. It's a good conversation. And what I like to chat with my clients about and how I view it is when you are in recovery, you're not using those behaviors, but self-care is continues and you continue, and that's a huge part of your recovery is and that journey just continues to keep going and you're continuing to learn about that. So you're dealing with anxiety and you're no longer wanting to use the eating disorder to control anxiety or to relieve anxiety, but you're still going to struggle with anxiety and self-care around anxiety. So it's really I
Right.
think viewing it as that is it is a big journey of self-care.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's a responsibility, I think. And today I even had a conversation with a client who was like, I'm tired. Like, I just want to break from having the responsibility to be human. And I was like, yeah, because the eating disorder told us for years that you didn't have to do that, that you were above taking care of yourself, that we could just numb out. And unfortunately, the human experience can be really hard, but we can use things to make it a little easier and find little pockets of happiness and joy and peace and cope through the rest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I love so kind of going into the barriers of self care that people may feel, and you mentioned one of them being impatience, like wanting to figure it out now, all of it to look how people wanted to look at in that moment. So you mentioned just finding like little things, doing little things, little moments. If you want to expand on that, but also any other barriers that you may have noticed on your journey, because I bet that was super hard to have. Here's a kit, I'm not doing it at all. It's a little overwhelming, right? I'm sure you experienced some hiccups there.
Definitely, definitely. I think honestly the philosophy I go by is the 1% to 5% better, I think is huge with the patients and understanding that it's our expectations lead to resentment. So if we have expectations that aren't met, we're going to be resentful of the process. So if we can have more manageable, realistic expectations of what self-care looks like and be like, oh, I actually don't feel that much better, but I'm actually conditioning my brain that I'm allowed to be kind to myself and that I can deal with this emotion without acting on it. That's a big thing for me. And then, other barriers honestly are like accessibility, I think money, and things like that. When I was in my recovery, I was living out in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and was a young adult right out of college paying student loans and all the things. And I was like living in like a basement with like random roommates. I was like struggle bus like city. And I remember I was just like, I couldn't afford, it was hard to like afford the food and it was hard to afford the things. So then I was like, oh, and also you want me to buy like nail polish? Like, sure. I remember I just kind of thought it was laughable. Like, I'm better than this. And I'm not an arrogant person, but the eating disorder brings out those disordered values where I was like, I can be better than this. I don't need that. But it turns out I really needed that. And I think maybe getting over that piece of I'm better than this and understanding that, yeah, might seem super simple, but it's actually very hard to take care of yourself. So accessibility, excuses that you make for yourself, things like that. I think we're barriers for sure.
So it sounds like it was, kind of self-care was this concept that was brought up during your recovery, but at one moment it was able to like maybe sink a little bit more. Maybe that's incorrect, but do you feel like that?
I missed the last part. At one moment, what?
Oh yeah, at one moment it was able to sink a little bit more. You were able to hear it a little bit differently.
Definitely. I think it was blind faith at one point because I was like, how is this going to be? I always talk to clients if they're using certain behaviors. It's that instant release. It's that there was that instant numbing, and it works. Biologically, it works somehow. It releases endorphins or whatnot, but in the long term it doesn't. It really doesn't work. And so I think understanding the expectations of it's not going to feel the same. So coloring in a coloring book and being honest about it. I remember my therapist was like, look, coloring in a coloring book is not going to feel the same as using behaviors. Let's just be real, you know, but eventually it does help. It does work. I remember when I started taking like warm baths, just clear baths, you know, like if you have a bathtub, take a bath. And I started taking warm baths, you know, after I used behaviors, and then it started to be before I did or had urges and things like that. And I remember I was a nanny and I was on a trip with them in Florida, and we had Thanksgiving, and that was a very stressful, triggering thing. But I had been about a year in recovery, really, really practicing this self-care kit and using these coping skills. And I remember I found myself in the bath. Like I remember being in the bath and being like, oh my God, like I've conditioned myself instead of using behaviors to take a bath. And that was like those neural pathways were finally strengthening of saying I can choose something nice for myself rather than destructive things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's I think of with those small changes, this one analogy, and I forgot where I've heard this, but where, you know, a pilot is in route to reach this destination, and they just tweak it by like 1 degree, and then they're in a totally different location. You found yourself like in the bath later, you know, and just all.
Yes, I love that
Yeah.
analogy.
Yeah, and I think it's, you know, again, this is so what you have mentioned is just this focus on the destination and what it needs to look like, and kind of like lack of mindfulness and like what can I do right now for myself. um, I think really keeps people back, and so I think self-care
Yes.
opens up some of these things. So I guess that would be my next question of, you know, how what do you think self-care opened up for you? Like it of course it got you in the habit of taking care of yourself in a different way. Do you think it helped to open up some like different ideas or feelings, or maybe, I don't know if.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it definitely was like a habituation effect. It conditioned me in a lot of ways, but it also it changed my priorities. Work was always priority for me. So it was like I had to suffer a certain amount to be successful. So, you know, it was like certain amount of hours worked and certain amount of hours exercised and, you know, all the things. It's like then I could earn being nice to myself. But reprioritizing that and saying like actually the self-care has to come first so then I can be a better person in all of these facets of my life. That changed a lot for me. In my recovery, you know, a lot, as I'm sure, you know, you can identify with your clients and things like that, you know, I always say that the icky part of recovery, that sucky part of recovery is when you're not necessarily reaping the benefits of recovery just yet. And like, you know, maybe it's that you're weight restoring or that you're eating more or whatever's happening and your body is in shock and your brain is in shock. I was so high functioning for so long, and then my eating disorder recovery almost seemed to hijack my high functioning behaviors. But I was like, wait a minute, like, why am I choosing recovery over that? Because I was so much more high functioning. It
Mhm.
just turned out that like I needed to keep pushing through, and then my life got so much better. Like I always kept thinking like there's either this hell or that hell.
Yes.
And I'm going to choose that hell.
Uh-huh.
But then I was like, if I can choose blind faith and keep pushing through and living in the moment and celebrating small little blips of victories and happiness. I was a mess in that period. I was fired from my job. I wasn't a wonderful girlfriend. I mean, it was hard, but if I kept like pushing through, and then I was like, oh my gosh, there was this option over here. And I would have never known that if I didn't keep pushing through.
Yeah. Oh gosh, I totally hear that. And I hear that a lot too. I've experienced that where you feel like, I what is this recovery for? And I feel like it's kind of the same voice that um, tells you this is where you should be. You're not there yet. Like all of these, that's kind of like shutting the door to things, and also saying like, oh, this is where recovery is too. It's like, well, no, it's not. Like you're still in it. But that can, I feel like that holds a lot of people back too.
Yeah, it's like this expectation. It's like this promised land. And
Mm-hmm.
that's great. And that helped me. But also, if we just tell each other, if we just tell someone like, oh, you have to wait this amount of time to get there, they're not going to choose that. It's too far away.
Yeah.
And it just doesn't make sense. So we have to say, okay, like today I'm going to do one thing that's going to brighten my day up a little bit, and I'm going to practice these things and choose to live in the now, because we can't just keep living for this promise. That's a lot of pressure.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think you speak a lot to like that grit, and I think it's really hard to initially start doing those, to get in the bath, and then
Yeah.
it's kind of messy and you're figuring out, and then it's really, beautiful at the end, and like that grit to keep going through all those hard parts
Mhm.
is so important. I always say just keep showing up, just keep
Yeah.
having that grit, and that means you're continuing to be on that route. Well, that is awesome. I want to just touch really quickly, and I know I want to end here soon because I'm trying to keep it somewhat a little bit shorter. Is so this recovery as a practice is not a destination, and you spoke a little bit to this in regards to, like, we touched on this with self-care and body image. Just curious, like, what, if you have anything you want to expand on that with.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess we'll talk, one thing with body image, I think that's a big thing is we, especially as women, are kind of told like once we get to a certain body, then we find our identity in that body. And, we then start to say like, oh, this is my body. I feel like we hopefully start to say like, okay, I can accept this. And then our body all of a sudden changes, because that's what happens with bodies. We change. They're not like this marble slab. They don't stay the same. And that can be really uncomfortable for us to understand because of just like, media manipulation, saturation of all these, diet culture images and things. But also our bodies do change, and sometimes for reasons that don't make sense. And so I talk about perceived body betrayal a lot with my clients and on social media, because things like chronic illness, or when your body starts to act differently or wrong, um, can be really hard, because then we start to hate on our bodies and say like, wait a minute, I thought I worked so hard on this body image thing. I thought I had finally reached body acceptance, and now I'm dealing with this. Like, what the heck? And so understanding that it's a perception that our body is betraying us, but actually our bodies are doing everything they possibly can to keep us alive. And that might be, spiking up your inflammation, or making, water retention, or making you gain weight, or, making certain things hurt. But what it's doing is it's saying, I want to keep you alive, so I'm going to, shut certain things down and work on these things. And it's still our responsibility to be kind and practice body kindness and self-care. And so that's where, I mean, it's like this practice. It's not just like you get there and you're done and like you've passed.
Yeah, yeah. So with body image, I couldn't agree more, and I think it's, instead of, and I find that for a lot of individuals, it's okay, I'm accepting this, but it's still changing, we're still growing, we're still like in this process, and we will always be. And so that's really hard to just, okay, I accept, and this is where I'm okay. But if it changes, that's just throws you back into that, like, just stressful state. So viewing it as like a relationship, as like, this is changing, we're always learning, we're always working together, and we're kind of, open to learning from each other, and showing appreciation, and because it's going to be consistently fluid. And I think that idea, which you hit on, is that it seeing it as this destination is just kind of sets people up for perceived failure or confusion, or yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just too high of an expectation.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Jane. This is extremely,
Yeah.
I'm sure this will be really wonderful for people to watch and kind of take some things away for their own recovery journey. So I really appreciate your time in both sharing your journey and helping, decrease the stigma around eating disorders, and just talk about these things.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.